This week on the Crisis Conflict Emergency Management Podcast.
Japan is, of course, a disaster-prone country. I think, for example, Japan experienced a big earthquake and a tsunami. So, as the responsibility of the people who are living in the disaster-prone countries, our responsibility is to tell our lessons, our experience to the world who are not experienced so many times. So, for example, in Indonesia, and the Japanese people saw how the tsunami is. And 7 years later, the northern part of Japan was hit by tsunami. But just after 7 years, we already forgot.
Welcome to the Crisis, Conflict, and Emergency Management Podcast, where we have global conversations and share perspectives about international crisis, preparedness, and how to build more resilient societies. My name is Kyle, and I will be your host. And just how vulnerable are we to the changing international environment, and what can we learn from this experience? From AI to space warfare to community development and crisis communications, there's something here for everyone. Join us for unique international conversations and perspectives into the current threats, challenges, and risks to our society. This podcast is brought to you by Capacity Building International and sponsored by the International Emergency Management Society. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Crisis, Conflict, and Emergency Management Podcast. My name is Kyle King, and I'm the founder and managing director of Capacity Building International, where we build more resilient societies through the use of emergency management and international programs. Which brings us to our guest today, Yosuke Okita, as we discuss international assistance, such as urban search and rescue teams, INSARAG, and the growing dependence of all nations on international assistance. Yosuke Okita has significant experience working in international disaster and emergency management, including emergency missions as a member of the JDR, the Japan Disaster Relief Team, and UNDAC, the UN Disaster Assessment and Coordination Team. And from 2003 to 2015, he had numerous international deployments to include the Algeria Earthquake, Indonesia Tsunami, Pakistan Earthquake, Great East Japan Earthquake, Christchurch, Typhoon Haiyan, and the Nepal Earthquake in 2015. After working with JICA's offices in Japan, which is the Japan International Cooperation Agency, Indonesia and St. Lucia, from 2014 to 2017, he worked for OCHA in Geneva as the Asian regional focal point for INSARAG, which is the International Search and Rescue Advisory Group, and UNDAC itself. Since 2017, he's worked for ASEAN Secretariat, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, as part of the Japan-ASEAN Integration Fund Management Team, and JICA's Indonesia office as a Project Formulation Advisor for ASEAN Partnership. Currently, he is working in Hanoi, Viet Nam, as JICA's expert in charge of Biodiversity and Admin Coordination in the Sustainable Natural Resource Management Project Phase 2. Yosuke received an LL.B. from Kyoto University, an MA in International Relations and Masters of Diplomacy from the Australian National University, and a PhD in Media and Governance from Keio University in Japan, and has several publications discussing international search and rescue efforts, which leads us to our topic today, international assistance programs. Yosuke, welcome to the podcast, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me for this podcast.
So one of the papers that you published in 2021 is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you today, because you were writing that due to globalization, more and more countries and organizations give assistance across state borders, with recipients not only limited to developing countries. So nations such as the United States, New Zealand, Japan have also received international assistance in recent years. And you have mentioned in your paper that this can also be problematic. And I think that's something that we don't really talk about very much in two different ways. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this. First of all, larger nations, more developed nations, we don't really think about international assistance very much, but it does occur, right? So it does occur in Hurricane Katrina and others sort of larger major international disasters in the United States. There is some international assistance that's provided. So first of all, we don't really think of it in terms, and so it doesn't become part of our planning all the time, especially at local levels. But you also take a different perspective of where you say it can also be a problem, right? So it's also a problem in terms of receiving assistance. And I'd love to sort of just hear your thoughts on that. So let's first start with the planning of international assistance. What have you seen recently or in your past with all these different deployments you've had about the way that international assistance has grown over the years?
Okay, so thank you very much for kind introduction. And it's about the article you talked about, the article which I wrote about the reception of international assistance. at the time of the greatest Japan earthquake in 2011. And as you kindly introduced, I was part of the UNDAC team, and I was in charge of the reception of the international assistance, focusing on mainly the international urban search and rescue teams. But at that time, as you can imagine, at that time, 90%, or I would say 99% of the damage was caused by tsunami, not the earthquake. In case of tsunami, international urban search and rescue, usually it takes more than 24 hours to arrive in the affected areas, cannot contribute to life saving. And they actually, in the greatest Japan earthquake, more than, I think it's about 20 and nearly 1,000 USAR, International Urban Search and Rescue workers were deployed to Japan, but they could not contribute to any life-saving activities, and they mainly contributed to recovery, especially the recovery of dead bodies and the debris activities. So the deployment itself was okay. Yes, they contributed, and as Japanese people, as one of the affected people, I was really encouraged by seeing so many teams supporting to Japan. But when we think about the cost effectiveness, of course, the International Urban Search and Rescue Team's purpose is not only life saving. Of course, they can contribute to recovery activities, so that's fine. But if we really think about the cost effectiveness of international user teams, I really doubt if the international user teams in the time of tsunami was a good choice to support the affected country. Maybe some other kind of assistance, such as cash contributions, might be more helpful to the affected country. And I want to introduce one example. At the time of the latest Japan earthquake and tsunami, some foreign teams, it might be NGOs, or I don't know if it's governmental organizations, that, so some foreign teams called to the local government of the northern part of Japan, which was the affected area, directly and asking if they need assistance in English. And you can imagine how it is difficult for them to deal with it, because not many Japanese people speak English, and they are already overstretched to deal with the disasters. And then there is an offer of international assistance in English. And it was really difficult for them to judge if they can deny that offer, because it's a cross-state border. So it's international and diplomatic issues. So it's really annoying. So that's why I raised this issue. Yep. So sometimes this too much offer or unnecessary offer from international community can be a burden for the affected country, especially the local government who has to deal with the disasters. Yeah.
That's interesting that you mentioned that. I mean, so we at CBI we teach the NATO Crisis Management Disaster Response course as part of our partnership with the NATO COE. And just this week, actually, when we were recording this podcast, we were talking about international security assistance, and we were talking about sort of the mismatch of it's almost the goodwill of nations to want to be able to donate equipment, to want to be able to provide assistance during disasters and emergencies and things like that. But often that assistance is mismatched against the needs and the requirements of the nation. And what you mentioned is, I want to talk about that for just a second, which is sort of the local level receiving sort of phone calls from people and international organizations or NGOs basically saying like, we have we'd like to help, we'd like to give some assistance, here's what we can give, do you want it or not? And that actually becomes a problem in terms of it's often a mismatch of needs and requirements. And then it's also an issue of you're going sort of directly to the local level so that you can get involved from an international perspective and you can donate, you can contribute, you can take action, but at the same time, it's not really centralized through the government and fitting needs and requirements. And so, how often do you see sort of that reach into the local level and sort of bypassing the national sort of focal points on these issues?
Actually, the number of these mega scale or big scale disasters are not so many. So in the past, as far as I know, Japan received the international assistance only twice. It's a Kobe earthquake in 1995 and the Great East Japan earthquake. But in the scale of Kobe earthquake and the Great East Japan earthquake, it's understandable because in Kobe, more than 6,000 people were killed. And in Great East Japan earthquake, nearly 20,000 people were killed. But now we discussed about the globalization, and more countries are ready for deployment of international assistance. And I think it was in 2016 in Kumamoto City. It's not too large city. It was hit by earthquake, and I think at that time about 20 or 30 people were killed at the end. So it's not a big disaster, but even such scale of disaster, there was offer of assistance from the foreign countries. And at that time, Japan did not receive international assistance. But now you asked how often, but in this globalized world, I think there are many cases that even if the scale of earthquake or disaster is not so big, other countries and international communities are happy to provide assistance.
So, in terms of that type of assistance, we've seen this growing sort of initiative, I guess we could say, in terms of, nations wanting to provide assistance, wanting to act more globally. How would you assess sort of the ability of nations to absorb all that extra assistance these days?
In terms of the capability to provide assistance, I think many countries are now ready for providing it. And I want to show one example in ASEAN countries because I worked for this area. And in the past, Indonesia, the countries such as Indonesia and the Philippines were always receiving these international disaster assistance. But now they are happy to provide assistance because they received this kind of assistance in the past. So the Indonesia Search and Rescue Team, which is called Basarnas, is now have IEC classified teams, which was classified in 2019. IEC stands for INSARAG External Classification, which started since 2005. And when we started the IEC, only developed countries such as the United States and some European countries and Japan were classified in this INSARAG external classification. But Indonesia is a typical example that so-called developing countries, but they are disaster prone and they usually receive international assistance, is now preparing for sending assistance. So that's why they went through the IEC INSARAG external classification. So I think the capability to provide assistance, many countries are now ready and happy to provide international assistance, including developing countries.
So, if we have more opportunities out there, if we have more opportunities or sources, I should say, if we have more sources of international assistance and nations are making this conscious step to be able to provide international assistance through mechanisms like INSARAG and others, what have you seen on the horizon in terms of planning factors for nations as they are they effectively planning to be able to receive international assistance? Is that a growing sort of scale as well in terms of especially not considering developing nations, but considering the more developed nations, which generally have more internal resources and capabilities? Is that external assistance being integrated more into the developed nations planning process?
I think it's really difficult, and especially for Japan, we received, as I said, we received international search and rescue teams and other kind of assistance at the time of Kobe earthquake and the Great East Japan earthquake. And just let me show one example. In the Kobe earthquake, we received some international urban search and rescue teams with search dogs. And at that time, it took a lot of time for the quarantine procedures for search dogs. So some teams brought the search dogs, but it took 1 or 2 days to enter the countries because the Japanese government at that time took the same procedures as usual. But at the time of the greatest Japan earthquake, which was about 15 years later after the Kobe earthquake, the procedure itself, as for the quarantine procedures for such dogs, were very smooth, so they can smoothly enter the country. So, in terms of this kind of small procedures, as in the case of Japan, they are now preparing for it. They are ready. But actually, the Japanese government is not integrating the international assistance into their disaster response plan. So they are not expecting to receive international assistance even now. So that's why it's really difficult. And we can see a lot of review reports at the time of the greatest Japan earthquake, but the official review report done by the government always appreciates the receiving international assistance. So we really appreciate your assistance, but they do not critically evaluate the assistance. But if we look at the review report of the Hurricane Katrina by the US and the Christchurch Earthquake in New Zealand, I think that's a good thing for the US and New Zealand. They critically evaluate the international assistance. So, for example, if we look at the review report done by the government of New Zealand, they clearly mentioned that they received the second batch of international user teams from Japan, but it's like they don't use the word mistake, but they can be done by the New Zealand resources. So in the response phase, we could receive the international assistance, but in the recovery phase, it should be done by the New Zealand resources. So if these countries really critically evaluate the international assistance, I think they can do better in the next time. Yeah. But still, for some countries, I think they are not ready for receiving international assistance, especially the developed countries.
So, what would it take from your experience? I know there's an entire program around sort of, especially with the
Mhm.
UN system in terms of receiving international assistance. But what are some of the key considerations, especially for those listening that may have never dealt with international assistance programs or receiving or even sending international aid or search and rescue teams or anything else like that? What are some of the considerations that you have to think about when you're receiving these types of teams? I mean, you mentioned dogs in quarantine and certain policy issues that have to be changed or expedited because of the emergency status and what has to occur there. But what other challenges must nations sort of deal with this regard?
Okay, I think one of the biggest challenges or the issue to be solved is that every country, including developed countries, need to check the reception system of international assistance. So, for example, the countries such as the Philippines and Indonesia, they used to receive international disaster assistance. So they already have the legal structure and like the quarantine structure to receive international assistance. So they are very good at receiving assistance. But if we look at the US, New Zealand, and the Japan, they didn't expect they are the recipient country, so they didn't have the legal structure, they didn't prepare for the quarantine system, etc. So it was really difficult. So, but in this globalized world, and due to the climate change, the scale of disasters are becoming bigger and bigger. So every country will have a chance to be the recipient of the international assistance. So they have to, every country, including developed countries, should check how to receive international assistance. And as we discussed, they should integrate the international assistance as part of their response plan.
Yeah, I agree. I think that what we're starting to see across the horizon, and we'll talk about that next, but what we're starting to see across the horizon here, if we're doing that sort of scanning, is that we're seeing because of climate change, because of different security issues and needs, that we're getting these transnational and cross-border sort of emergencies, disasters, and security situations that are leading to more regional approaches as well as international assistance programs having to be designed and incorporated as part of our national response frameworks and planning as we look at these issues. I mean, it's even if we take a case of looking at the current Ukraine conflict, it's not is even that the disaster or the incident has to occur within your own nation. You are also sort of impacted by what's happening in your neighbor countries. The massive influx of refugees from a large scale disaster could be significant and apply significant pressure on your own communities within your own nation just because you simply border that. And that's where, when we think in terms of, at least in my opinion anyway, right? So when we look at, like, in the United States, we say, well, okay, we have states, there could be border state issues, of course, but you could look at, like, for example, the Texas Mexico border, migration issues, and sort of pressures being applied onto the southern states within the United States as well. And so I think these pressures are sort of applied everywhere and in many different frames and perspectives, from disaster to climate change to sort of mass migration and everything else. And it's sort of, in the future, is reflecting this more complicated approach to responding to disasters. And what I mean by that is that we can't really just be completely reliant upon our own internal resources. While that's an excellent sort of starting point, we have to acknowledge and at least start to incorporating the idea of maybe we need additional assistance because it is an issue of complexity or size and just massive scale, that we could use some rapid international assistance to help stabilize a certain situation. And then it's also the impact around our bordering nations and what's happening there as well. So I think we do have to take this more holistic approach in terms of that. But based off the work that you're seeing and the work that you're doing and sort of your deployments, what are you seeing in terms of the future of sort of these larger scale disasters that might be occurring, and especially their impact on our, say, more global and connected societies?
I think it's a difficult question, but for example, now since 2020, we are living in the world of the COVID-19, and I think in the future, sending and receiving international disaster assistance will be more difficult. For example, during the COVID-19 era, some countries do not want to receive international assistance from the countries with many COVID-19 cases, and vice versa. Some countries do not want to send international assistance to the countries with many COVID-19 cases. And another reason is that, for example, in the Nepal earthquake, there were many international urban search and rescue teams were deployed, but most of them were stayed in Kathmandu city. But more damage was caused in the mountainous areas in Nepal, and but international user teams could not reach these mountainous areas. So what I want to highlight is that to strengthening the local capability to deal with disasters is will be much more important during the COVID-19 era. And as you mentioned, in the world with a lot of complex emergencies, because sometimes it will be more difficult to cross state borders in the emergency phases, and it always will take more time to reach the affected area. So that's why to strengthen the local capability as first responders who are already in the affected area will be important.
That's a great point, right? And that's a great point, because when we talk about complex emergencies, and I'm just trying to frame my thoughts here, but when we think about complex emergencies, we never talk about sort of layered crisis, right? So just because we had COVID doesn't mean there wasn't an earthquake, right? But what happened is, in what I might call a layered sort of complex emergency, these layered different situations happening that's affecting each other. So now you have a pandemic which is affecting international assistance, which is leading to a degraded response or a lesser response from the international community in terms of international assistance. Or maybe it's not less, but it's longer, it takes longer, it's slower because of the pandemic situation. So we have these layers of crisis, maybe, right? Which make things even just more complicated. And so that's an interesting point, but it comes back, and I'd like to bring that into the point that you made about building local capacity, as it's almost as if that's a mitigation to having to need international assistance.
Yeah. I pointed out the strengthening local capabilities because that's also from my experience in INSARAG. So I introduced about the example of the INSARAG external classification for Indonesian teams. So in the past, Indonesia was always receiving international assistance, but now they are willing to provide international disaster assistance. So that's why they went through the INSARAG external classification process to prepare for it. But one interesting point is that at first they wanted to try strengthen one international team in Indonesia, but these members strengthened or trained for INSARAG methodology is now becomes trainer for domestic local teams. So having one strong international teams lead to strengthening the local capabilities. So that's why I wanted to emphasize this point. So sometimes this international assistance. So INSARAG studied from how to coordinate international assistance, how to strengthen international user teams. But now INSARAG external classification lead to strengthening local capabilities. And as we discussed, maybe during the COVID-19 or in the situation of the complex emergencies, it will be difficult for other countries to send international user teams immediately. But if during the peacetime, before disasters happen, through the INSARAG methodologies, INSARAG external classification, international user teams can support strengthening local capabilities. I think it will lead to saving more lives, even if we cannot send international user teams.
Yeah, I think that's going to be an important theme in the future, at least in my opinion, because what we're starting to see, I think, more and more, what has happened with global crisis in the last few years is that we're seeing the strength and the resiliency of local communities being the key factor to stabilize and sort of mitigate or prevent any sort of real disasters and events from occurring, at least the damage from these and the effects from these sort of disasters and natural disasters. And so what I see is as we start emphasizing more and more local capacities and sort of the resilience of local communities to be able to mitigate, prevent, respond, and recover from these types of incidents, what I see is that it's moving from this global perspective down to a more local perspective, because as long as you can sort of withstand that, you can use the word resilience or you can use anti-fragile, whatever you want to use, but as long as the local communities are strengthened and the capacity is there to deal with these issues, then that is meaning less of an impact globally. And I think it's coming out in terms of many different things. We're talking about supply chain resilience. We're talking about not only response mechanisms, but more emphasis and money going into resilience and sustainable development, like is what I believe you're currently working on. And sustainable natural resources so. Can we talk about that a little bit in terms of what you're working on now and some of the portfolio and topics that you're dealing with?
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Currently, I'm working for the Sustainable Natural Resource Management project, and the main purpose is to create or to develop the sustainable forest management in Vietnam. And as you can imagine, to have the strong forest, of course, leads to preventing the floods, flash floods. So it leads to preventing disasters. So I think I'm still working for disaster management.
Yeah, and so in Vietnam, they're looking at that from the perspective of mitigation, right? So forest management to mitigate future floods and other natural disasters.
Yeah.
And so, what are some of the key issues that you're seeing from that sort of region in terms of trying to manage these things?
Since I have worked with the ASEAN Secretariat in the last 5 years, I think this region is very good example in terms of regional cooperation of disaster management. And I think some of the listeners, are aware of the AHA Center, or ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance on Disaster Management, which was established in 2011. So the function of the AHA Center is very similar to the UN OCHA and the UNDAC. They have a very similar system of ERAT, Emergency Rapid Assessment Team. I think ERAT team is very similar function of the UNDAC team. So in the past, this region, of course, needed to receive international assistance from the outside of the ASEAN region, but now they are trying to do it by themselves. So they have the ERAT team. So if there is a big disaster, they deploy the ERAT team, conduct assessment, and issue the AHA Center situation report. And these teams will establish the Joint Operations Coordination Center or something, which is very similar function of OSOC. And I think I want to introduce one word from the former executive director of the AHA Center, Mr. Said Faisal. So he in the past said this kind of things. So the ASEAN region will prioritize the international assistance from the friends instead of strangers. So for them, friends means the ASEAN member states. So not only diplomatic relationships, but they conduct a joint training during the peacetime. So they know each other. So disaster managers, emergency managers of ASEAN member states know each other. So if so, once disasters happen, their coordination should be much smoother. So of course, UNDAC EU has a very good system, very good human resources, so they can coordinate the disaster situation very well. But of course, they are sometimes strangers of the ASEAN member states because they have never conducted the joint training. But now the ASEAN region is trying to do it by their region. So I think this is a good example of the regional cooperation of this region, ASEAN.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great example. If we come back to the INSARAG piece and then we look at the search and rescue teams again, so if they're taking this regional approach and they're creating sort of this regional capability, and as we talked about, you develop one really international professional team, then you build local capacities to be able to respond accordingly at a local level. Then you have this national team, then you have this regional approach to response. What does that mean for the future of like the more international UN Interag system with all these international teams? Do you see that they're going to be called out less frequently because nations are going to more regional programs and cooperation as well as building local capacity?
Yeah, actually, that's my expectation. So in the future, the deployment of international user teams should decrease because each country can build their local capacity. Some countries can deal with the disasters within their countries by themselves. And even if they cannot deal with it by themselves, now the regional teams can support it. So if there is a big earthquake in Indonesia, they don't have to request support from the European countries or the United States, which is very far. But instead, if there are enough number of INSARAG external classified teams in the ASEAN region, the Indonesia can request these teams only from their region. So if we look at the number of IEC classified teams as of now, probably more than 70% of IEC classified teams are in Europe. But I'm from Asia, and Asia is one of the most disaster earthquake-prone countries. And in my opinion, more IEC classified teams should be in Asia so that the international user teams from the region can support this region. So that's my expectation. I think I agree with you. And so in the future, there should be no international, but at first we can seek the regional support and then international support. But the frequency of requesting international support should decrease.
Yeah, I think that's part of the work that we do is in the international space, and we go visit different countries, and we hold different working groups and things like that. And that's really something that we're seeing as well, is really the emphasis on going to regional partners because it's closer, it's cheaper, there's a common sort of understanding, and oftentimes language helps tremendously, right? And so there's a real emphasis I think I've seen in the last say 5 years to really go more focused on a regional response mechanism as opposed to these larger complex international assistance mechanisms. If we talk about the international assistance piece for a second, and because you also wrote in, I think it was in your paper, that you were also saying that sort of releasing of timely and accurate information, even in terms of English language, right? If that's the language that the assistance is being offered in, is critically important to be able to manage international assistance. So, we talked previously about how sort of some organizations might reach out to a local level but be challenged by language issues and things like that. So how important is it to have that centralized flow of information during an international disaster to these international assistance organizations like OCHA, like others, maybe even other nation states, and being able to try and coordinate that assistance?
Okay, I want to introduce the example of Japan. So firstly, at the time of the 1995 Kobe earthquake, by this earthquake, more than 6,000 people were killed. So it was a really big earthquake. And at that time, Japan, of course, did not have a system to release the information in English. So that's why the international community, especially the European countries and the United States and some other countries, had to rely on the information from the international media, such as CNN and the BBC. And of course, their focus is both to damaged areas, so they shooted the collapsed building, and the international community will see that, oh, in Kobe, the situation is really bad. But at the same time, of course, the Japan is very disaster-prone country, and we are very prepared. So the Japanese government, including local government, provided much assistance. Yeah. And actually, there was no need for requesting international assistance, but the BBC, CNN, and the other international media released the footage that there is no rescue workers in this site, something like that. But the problem was not the rescue resources itself. The problem was the transportation from other cities such as Nagoya, Osaka, and Tokyo to Kobe City. So that's why there was no need to request international assistance. So that's the one. If the Japanese government and the local government can release that information, the problem is not the resource itself. We have the resource, but the problem is the transportation. It's blocked due to the damage. Probably the international community did not send international assistance. And at the time of the Great East Japan earthquake, yes, the situation was almost same, but the one difference was that the Japanese government requested the UNDAC team. And UNDAC team, at that time, I was part of that team, focused on releasing the information in English. So every morning I bought the Japanese newspapers and we translated it into English, and the other members drafted the OCHA situation report. So we, as an UNDAC team, we released information damage, but at the same time, we provided a lot of information on the Japanese government and the local government response. So there is enough rescue workers and enough medical support. And at this stage, we don't need international NGO support, international support in terms of in-kind support, etc. So that's why I think it contributed to stopping, to avoiding to receive unnecessary international assistance. So, but without this releasing timely information, especially in English for the international community, the affected countries will need to receive unnecessary international assistance. And this unnecessary international assistance, as we discussed, can be a burden for the affected government and the local government.
I think that there's a point to be made here, because when we look at international assistance mechanisms, you're looking at sort of a UN standardized system, especially with INSARAG, and there's a set amount of people and equipment and SOPs and procedures. So it's all very standardized. It's all very interoperable. And because of that, you can request that and generally get that assistance, let's say, fairly quickly. Now, the other side of that is exactly what you're talking about, that we're currently seeing in some places like in Ukraine because of the conflict, which is the fact that you don't need exactly that. Like you said, there's enough response capability, but we need transport capability. And when you make these general requests about transport capability, then you really don't get a very quick response, because nations are not, and organizations are not prepared to send something that's not standardized, right? So it's like, okay, well then what is a transport capability? And then they have to go try and find something, to donate or to deliver as a transport capability. And then it's all sorts of questions about standardization and sort of the ability to send it, and logistics and procurement. And so that it's a very interesting sort of perspective on it, because all the standardized assistance that we've designed over the last 20 years, 30 years, however long it's been, is becoming, as I would dare say, less relevant, right? In terms of specialized international assistance or specific international assistance. And so we've seen some requests, for example, coming out of Ukraine that are very, very specific. And then we've seen them deny other things, saying like, we don't need this because we have plenty of this stuff, which is a good thing, right? So it's a good thing to be seeing. It's a good thing to have in place, that nations are actually saying, no, thank you, we don't need this. There's too much already. But what I think is going to happen.
I think you made a
Go ahead.
very important point. And in terms of that you mentioned specialized assistance, I want to introduce one example from Indonesia. So as I said, the countries such as the Philippines and Indonesia, they used to receive international assistance in the past. So they already have a good system to receive international assistance. And at the time of the 2018 Sulawesi earthquake and tsunami in Indonesia, the Indonesian government, at first, many international community offered international search and rescue teams, but the Basarnas team, which is the international Indonesia search and rescue team organization, said no to international search and rescue teams. But they said we need the transportation, so they requested C-130 airplane to transport the relief goods from other cities to Palu, which was the center of the city. So I think this is a good example of the specialized assistance. The international disaster assistance does not have to be rescue, medical, relief goods, but they can request transportation, or as the Japanese government did, we can request coordination, the information management team.
Well, it just shows the value of information, right? And I think it shows the value of nations having to have a thorough understanding of sort of the assistance that they need, and being able to communicate that in a timely and efficient way to donors or international organizations or whatever the case is, to be able to do that. I know that there's a lot of frustration with some nations in terms of like receiving requests and then having things duplicated, and then nations getting too much stuff. And so I think that that's where the nation plays that critical role in that whole component there. So in terms of looking at the future, so we sort of talked about this now. We talked about this, and I'm not sure of a great way to phrase it. I can't think of it right now, but in terms of this standardized packages of assistance, but the need to have of course regional response is far better, and as far as building local capacity, and then the ability to sort of maybe that standardized assistance is only going to be needed in sort of extreme cases or in nations which don't have the ability to develop their own local capacity. But what are we seeing in the future here? If we sort of talked about a lot of things that were happening today with the nations and international response, and we talked about a little bit about what the future holds and sort of these layered ways of providing assistance and where we're going regionally. But let's bring it back to the community level now. Like what should communities be doing in order to be able to be more prepared, especially in this aspect of assistance programs?
Since I'm originally from Japan, Japan is of course a disaster-prone country, and I think, for example, Japan experienced a big earthquake and a tsunami. So, for as a responsibility of the people who are living in the disaster-prone countries, our responsibility is to tell our lessons, our experience to the world who are not experienced so many times. So, for example, in Indonesia, and the Japanese people saw how the tsunami is. But and 7 years later, the northern part of Japan was hit by tsunami. But we just after 7 years, we already forgot that lessons from Indonesia. Also, we are very disaster-prone countries. But if we really remember how the tsunami is, how we can evacuate from the tsunami, I think more lives should be saved. So, and I don't know, you are now in Germany or somewhere in European less disaster-prone countries, but I think the case of a Haiti earthquake, Haiti in the past was not thought that they are disaster-prone countries, but suddenly there was a very big earthquake, so they don't know much about the earthquake, how the earthquake is, how they can evacuate from earthquake and the floods and other types of disasters. But if they learned from other countries' experience, I think more people will be more prepared and we can save more lives. So now we are living in the globalized world. So what we can do as part of the preparation is to share our lessons and experiences, especially from disaster-prone countries. So that's why the disaster-prone countries such as Philippines, Indonesia, Japan, we have a lot of responsibility on that.
I think one of the challenges in terms of building that type of preparedness culture, as you mentioned, is sort of the frequency of exposure, right? And so, unless you're exposed to these challenges, these disasters, or these situations on a fairly reoccurring basis, you simply don't keep it fresh in your mind. I think our communities we lose that very quickly, and we focus on the next crisis or next scandal or next whatever is in social media. And so we don't necessarily have that culture of preparedness like I think that we should probably have. You mentioned that that's sort of a challenge in Japan as well. Is it largely the same, even though you have sort of, as you said, very disaster prone sort of location geographically, and you still are challenged with the cultural preparedness, I guess I would say.
Yeah, I think it's a very big challenge for even in Japan as well. And if you go to Kobe, there was a big earthquake museum, and which is very nice museum to remember the experience of the disaster at the time of Kobe earthquake. And if you go to the northern part of Japan, we still have the remains, like the wrecked ship, etc., to remember the lessons experience of tsunami. But even so, still it is really difficult to remember the experience knowledge of disasters. And it's already more than nearly 12 years have passed since the greatest Japan earthquake and the tsunami. And I think many people in Japan already becoming forgot about their memories of the tsunami. So if there is a big tsunami again in Japan, probably not many people cannot evacuate quickly. But regarding the preparedness, one good example of Japan is that every year in Japan we had the evacuation exercise from the earthquake. So that's like the Memorial Day of the Kanto earthquake in 1923. It was a big earthquake in Tokyo area, and many people were killed. And to remember that earthquake, every September, usually the Japanese schools and even companies have the evacuation drill exercise from. So for example, in this year, the drill is based on earthquake scenario, and the next year, the drill is based on the tsunami scenario. It depends on the location of the school, company, etc. But I think this is a very good opportunity for us to remember the lessons from the big earthquake and disasters, and how to check the evacuation route, etc.
Mm. So when they do this scenario, they run this exercise. Is that really an evacuation, or is it more just sort of based on a school evacuation or an office evacuation from the facility or the building, or did they actually do a like evacuate certain amount of the city?
No, it's like a school evacuation or company evacuation. So
Okay,
they already know the scenario. So on this day, we will have this evacuation drill. So we already know it, but we just to check the evacuation route, how we gather and how we check to make sure everyone is here. So they already know the scenario, but still, I think
sure.
it is very good opportunity for us.
Okay, no, that's interesting. I was curious if they were doing sort of more larger scale evacuations, which can be very complicated, but that'd be also very interesting. Okay, great. So, Yosuke, thank you very much for joining us today and sort of sharing your experiences, especially in terms of international assistance. I think it's going to be very interesting next sort of 5 to 10 years as we see the emphasis on local capacity development, regional cooperation, and then maybe less standardized international assistance. Or we see that nations take more of a role in as a key player in terms of information management and requests and actually identifying specific things that they need so that we can contain things locally and then respond internationally with specific requirements. So, yeah, very much appreciate your time. If somebody wants to reach out to you and to contact you, how can they find you? What's the best way?
If you search my name by LinkedIn or ResearchGate, if you put Yosuke Okita, I think you can find me easily.
Okay, great. And we'll also keep a link to your LinkedIn inside the show notes. And so anybody that's interested, they can take a look there as well. And once again, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Okay, thank you very much.
This podcast is brought to you in partnership between Capacity Building International and the International Emergency Management Society. You can join teams today at tiems.info. That's tiems.info. And also sign up for the International Emergency Management newsletter by CBI at capacitybuildingint.com. Is there a topic you would like to hear about? Or are you a functional expert and want to be featured on our show? If so, reach out to us at info@capacitybuildingint.com and let us know. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time.